especial que vai ser oferecida pelo professor John Connolly dentro do Programa de Estudos Espaciais da Universidade Internacional do Espaço. Então, esse não é um evento do SSP. Ele está oferecendo essa palestra de maneira específica para o nosso público. Tá? Então, nós estamos recebendo aqui em São José dos Campos esse programa, né, de estudos espaciais. O programa tem, às quartas-feiras, sempre uma atividade que também está acontecendo aqui dentro desse auditório. Mas como hoje é um dia especial, hoje é o aniversário do pouso do homem na Lua. Então, a gente não poderia deixar de fazer referência a essa data, principalmente estando recebendo na nossa cidade o evento que a gente está recebendo. E tendo aqui nessa cidade as instituições que nós temos. Então, muitos talvez não saibam, mas o Programa Espacial Brasileiro, as atividades espaciais no Brasil acontecem nessa cidade. Então, a cidade precisa saber disso, a cidade precisa ter consciência da relevância do seu papel dentro do cenário nacional, em vários segmentos, mas de maneira muito particular, que é o que nos afeta no setor espacial. Então, é dentro desse contexto, né, tendo aqui entre nós vários experts, várias pessoas que estão vindo do mundo inteiro para São José para participar como professores dentro do Space Studies Program, que a gente tem a oportunidade, então, de ter nessa noite o John Connolly, que vai ser apresentado daqui a pouco a vocês pelo nosso pesquisador do INPE, o Odílio Aguiar. Ele vai ser o mestre de cerimônias dessa noite. Então, vocês vão ter a oportunidade de participar, né, de acompanhar uma palestra desse pesquisador da NASA a respeito do que está sendo celebrado hoje, tá? Do aniversário da participação humana nas atividades, vamos dizer assim, da Lua, né? Da presença humana da Lua. A palestra vai ser oferecida em inglês, tá? Nos eventos que envolvem a presença de crianças e de jovens, a gente tem buscado a tradução, mas com uma palestra desse teor, uma tradução em tempo real iria dificultar a dinâmica. Então, ela vai ser oferecida somente em inglês. Ela também vai ser transmitida ao vivo pelo canal do INPE. Então, vocês vão poder assistir novamente, vocês que estão aqui poderão assistir novamente se quiserem, e poderão recomendar para que outras pessoas também assistam. Vai ficar disponível agora para sempre que a gente quiser acessar, tá bom? Então, agora eu vou convidar o Odílio Aguiar, nosso pesquisador do INPE. Odílio, eu sinto muito, eu não tenho a sua biografia preparada. Você pode, por gentileza, se apresentar? O Odílio, ele é um pesquisador premiado, uma pessoa que tem uma história de pesquisa maravilhosa, que precisa ser também conhecida. Então, por favor, Odílio, se você puder fazer o favor de se apresentar inicialmente para o nosso público, e a partir daí o Odílio vai ser o mestre de cerimônias dessa noite, tá bom? Então, agradeço a todos vocês pela presença e fiquem atentos às programações, né, dos eventos dentro do Space Studies Program, que até o final de agosto vai trazer muita coisa boa para São José ainda, tá bom? Então, muito obrigada e boa noite a todos. Odílio, por gentileza, se apresente, sem modéstia.
Obrigado, Mônica. Bom, meu nome é Odílio Aguiar, eu sou pesquisador titular do INPE e eu estou envolvido na pesquisa de detecção de ondas gravitacionais, que vocês devem ter ouvido falar. Em 2016 foi feita o anúncio da detecção ocorrida no ano anterior, em 2015, e de lá para cá eu venho trabalhando junto com a colaboração LIGO. Aliás, na verdade, nós entramos na colaboração LIGO, que foi a que fez a detecção antes disso, né? E então, como é um ramo novo da astrofísica, ele está tendo muitas descobertas, e isso, então naturalmente as pessoas que estão envolvidas ficam no foco dos spots, né, por causa das descobertas que estão sendo feitas, né? Bom, eu vou chamar então o convidado, o palestrante, o professor John Connolly.
Thank you very much.
I would like to say his biography to you. John Connolly has 30 years of experience as an ISU faculty member, including as director of ISU Space Studies Program. He currently serves as a lunar mission and lunar lander spacecraft expert in NASA's Human Landing System program. In prior NASA's assignments, Connolly served as exploration chief scientist at NASA's headquarters, as head of the Human Mars Mission Planning Team, lead of Human Lunar Surface Systems Team, and the deputy manager of the Exploration Missions and Systems Office at the Johnson Space Center. Previously, he served as a deputy project manager and vehicle engineer manager for the Altair Lunar Lander project. And prior to that, he served in various positions at NASA Headquarters Exploration Systems Mission Directorate, including deputy of the Exploration Systems Architecture Study Team, special assistant to JSC Astronaut Office and senior systems engineer, and in JSC Exploration Office. Connolly holds engineering degrees and from Penn State University and the University of Colorado, and is a registered professional engineer in Texas. He is an author and has lectured worldwide as human space exploration. On human space exploration. As a 36-year veteran of NASA's exploration efforts, Connolly has devoted his career to creating the future systems that will return crews to the moon and transport them to Mars and beyond. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. That was Hola y obrigado. I need to shorten that a lot. Well, thank you for being here tonight. It is a special night. Today, July 20th, we celebrate the anniversary of humans walking on the moon. So 54 years ago, right about now, I was a 9-year-old boy sitting in front of my parents' television about this far away, watching Neil and Buzz walk on the moon. And I've been very fortunate in my NASA career that I've eventually had the opportunity to work with Neil and Buzz and work on getting people back to the moon. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about Apollo and what we learned from it, but then we're going to compare it to the new program that NASA is undertaking to send people back to the moon, and that program is called Artemis. So our topic tonight is From Apollo to Artemis. So we start with a timeline. So our timeline starts back when I was a 9-year-old here, and that's when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and Buzz Aldrin, still around from that mission. We see him a lot on social media. And the Apollo missions went all the way through 1972. And the last Apollo missions flew then. And of those 12 individuals who walked on the moon, only 4 are still alive. This is one of the reasons why we have to get back to the moon. I can't imagine a world where we live and there's nobody alive who has ever walked on another planet. So we need to get people back to the moon, and we need to get some of you back there too. Now, I've taken that timeline, and I really wish this wouldn't feed back like this. I've taken that timeline and I've put it all the way back here. So there's 1966 through 72. Here's all the years since then, and there's a lot of them. Nobody has walked on the moon since here, and we're hoping that in 2025 or 2026 maybe, that the next crew of people will walk on the moon. So in that timeline, nobody's walked on the moon, but Brazil has won a few World Cups. So yay, maybe there's maybe there's more in here somewhere. So that just means it's been a long time. And so let's compare what the Apollo program looked like versus what NASA's Artemis program looks like. And you'll see there are some things that are very similar and some things that are very different. This is the Apollo Saturn V that took us to the moon in the 1960s and 70s. This is NASA's new SLS, Space Launch System. This is our new big rocket. And these pictures were essentially taken in the same building, looking down in the same direction. So you can see that there's a lot of similarities there. In addition, once we take these vehicles out to the launch pad, again, a lot of similarities. Here's an Apollo Saturn V. Here's an Artemis SLS launch vehicle. On top of those vehicles are the spacecraft that take the humans, that protect the humans. It's where the crew goes. And so in Apollo, we had what was called the Command Service Module. It was about 3.8 meters in diameter, and it held 3 crew members. The current Orion capsule is 5 meters in diameter, and it's designed for 4 crew and for much longer periods of time in space. So we have grown a little bit since Apollo. The lunar lander is another case. It has definitely grown since Apollo. So you may recognize the venerable lunar module that took us to the moon in the 60s and 70s. Since then, NASA has decided that we will let commercial industry build the next lunar lander. And the first contractor that we chose was SpaceX. And this is the lunar lander that SpaceX proposed, 50 meters tall. It's a large building, basically. And the crew is up here, and there's an elevator that goes down the side. So sort of a penthouse apartment. And it's a very capable vehicle. SpaceX uses it for many other things, or they want to use it for many other things, like going to Mars someday. So it's a bit over-designed to go to the moon, but it can land on the moon just fine. So you see, in terms of the lunar lander, we've changed a little bit between Apollo and Artemis. And we also picked another lunar lander contractor recently, and I'll talk about that. So the Artemis program is all about going back to the moon. We're going to relearn the art of exploration and to benefit us all. There is great science to be done, there's technologies to be developed, and there is just great inspiration in sending people like you and I out into space. So what exactly is Artemis? We sort of understand what Apollo was back in the old times, but Artemis is something a little bigger. So Artemis is really meant to be an international, global program of exploration. It's not just NASA racing the Russians to get to the moon. It's meant to be a program that envelopes a lot of different countries and a lot of different locations. So it's not just the moon, or the surface of the moon, it's also putting a vehicle in orbit around the moon, a small space station. And then ultimately it's about using everything that we know from those missions to take us to Mars. So here's the piece parts of Artemis. We have the big launch vehicle, the Space Launch System. We have the spacecraft where the crew ride in, the Orion. We have the big landers, called the Human Landing System. We have things that we do on the surface, including a brand new type of spacesuit that I'll show you. We have the little space station in lunar orbit, the Gateway. We have things that we need here on the ground to build the spacecraft and to control it and communicate with it. We're going to be building new rovers for both robotic means and for the humans to ride. And the rovers will be both open cockpit rovers as well as pressurized rovers. And then there's going to be a lot of other infrastructure that we need, like power systems and communication systems and habitat systems that go to the surface. So there's a lot of pieces, and right now we're working on this one, this one, this one, and this one. So we've got about the first half of those in development right now. Okay, so one of the questions we get is, why go back to the moon? Haven't we been there already? Well, technically we have been there, but we've explored very little of it. Imagine if explorers from another world came here to the Earth and they landed in Rio on the beach, and they explored nothing but the Copacabana area. And then they went in their spaceships and they went back home. And they said, we have totally explored Earth. We've seen everything there is to see. And it's got a very nice ocean and lots of sand. Well, that really isn't what the entirety of the Earth is. And just like that, we haven't really explored very much of the moon. We have literally just scratched the surface. We brought back rocks and soil samples back in the Apollo days. We did some experiments, but there are fundamental things we don't even know about the moon. We don't know if the moon has a liquid or solid core. That's a pretty basic thing to know about a planet, and we don't know that yet. We found out things since we've been there in the Apollo program that are very intriguing. Like, if you go to the south pole of the moon, there are permanently shadowed craters. And there's some on the North Pole too. And these are craters where the bottoms of the craters have never seen sunlight in many, many millions of years. That means that anything that falls into these craters, like meteorites or asteroids, is frozen in place. So they contain a record of all the stuff that's coming from space over many millions of years, and a lot of that could be water ice. And that's very intriguing to think that we could find water on the moon. You know, the moon is this dry, dusty, sort of not very habitable place to live. Imagine if we find water on the moon, what we could do with that. Besides having water to drink for our crews, we could split it into hydrogen and oxygen and make it into rocket fuel. We can make it into the oxygen the crew needs to breathe. Water in space is worth more than gold. So it's very exciting to think that we might be able to explore the moon and find some resources that will really help us stay there. And then, of course, going back to the moon is going to be exciting, because it's going to be people like you and me going back to the moon, except it's going to be this generation's Neil Armstrong. And we're going to send finally the first woman to the moon, and finally crews that represent perhaps a little bit more of the diversity of the world, and international crew members as well. So one of these days, a Brazilian citizen is going to walk on the moon. And that's going to be very exciting. But it's going to take some work. So I'm going to give you a little preview of all of the things we're doing now to get ready for that time when we return. So I talked about a few of these earlier. This is the Space Launch System. This is our new rocket, and there it is being rolled out to the launch pad. We launched it for the first time last year, and it did not have a crew on board. We sent it around the moon. We sent an Orion capsule around the moon, brought it home in a dress rehearsal of what will be the next mission that we send when we actually have crew aboard. So that's the big launch vehicle. If you're looking at how big it is, right now it's currently in this configuration here in the middle. In a few flights from now, we're going to put a different upper stage on it. And at that point, it will be almost exactly the same size as the Saturn V was back in the Apollo days. And by comparison, we thought the shuttle was a pretty big vehicle. It's pretty short compared to everything else. Orion. Orion is our crew capsule. And this is an actual picture taken from the Artemis 1 mission, where we went out beyond the moon and looked back at it. There are some very nice pictures we took where you see the moon and the Earth in back of it. So we've gone farther out into space than we've ever ventured with a vehicle meant for humans. And this will be the view that the next crew sees when they enter Orion and journey out into space in the Artemis 2 mission at the end of next year. So the end of 24 is going to be very exciting. So that's our Orion spacecraft out beyond the moon. It's composed of a number of pieces. whoops, too many clicks. The first part is the crew module itself. That's where the crew stays. And like I said, it's a 5-meter diameter cone. Behind that is a propulsion module built by the European Space Agency. So this is another place where things are different than they were in Apollo. In Apollo, the US wanted to do all this stuff themselves because they had to get it done very quickly, and we had to get to the moon to beat the Russians. And now it's more about partnerships and partnering with international partners and commercial partners as well. So we have the Europeans building this, and then there's some other parts that help pull the capsule away in case something goes wrong during launch. So that's Orion. Then there's all the stuff on the ground. We call this Exploration Ground Systems, EGS. And Exploration Ground Systems are all those big facilities we need to build vehicles like the SLS and to test them and integrate them and to roll them out to the launch pad and eventually get them ready to launch. So ground systems are amazingly expensive, as it turns out. You could spend almost as much on a launch pad as you can on a launch vehicle. So there's the Space Launch System sitting on the mobile transporter going up to its launch pad down in Florida. Pretty impressive sight. A little timeline. So as I said, we launched the Artemis 1 mission at the end of 2022. So that mission is complete. It was almost a complete success. We were very happy about it. It was the first launch ever of SLS. It was the first deep space flight of Orion, and everything worked great. That's very odd in the space business. These systems are very complex, and it's not unusual for them maybe not to work exactly right the first time, but we had a very good day and everything worked just the way it should. Artemis 2 is the next mission coming up. This is the first time we will send humans beyond the moon for the first time in over 50 years. And that's very, very exciting. We've picked the crew for this, and I'll show you who that is. But we'll finally have a crew that will be able to look at the Earth from beyond the moon again. Artemis 3 is scheduled for 2025, and that will be the first time we land back on the moon. Right now, the plan is to take 4 people out to the moon, put 2 of them in the lander, and have 2 land while 2 stay in orbit. And they'll stay on the surface for 6 days. Artemis 4 then comes maybe a year after that. That will be focused on building the Gateway, that small space station that's going to be put in orbit around the moon that will be our transportation node when we go to the moon, and that's where the lander and everything will meet up and go down to the surface. And then there's Artemis 5 and beyond. We'll start delivering rovers and pieces of surface habitat, and the idea is to build up surface infrastructure so that we can have longer and longer stays on the surface. So a little more detail. Here's the launch of Artemis 1. It launched in November of last year and returned in December, so it was quite a long mission. If you recall, the Apollo missions were about 10 days in length, maximum. The Artemis missions, can be 20 to 30 days in length. And that's because the vehicles we have much more capability than the vehicles did back in the Apollo days. So we for the first time, we launched the SLS, the Orion, and we used all the launch infrastructure on that mission. Artemis 2 will have a few firsts. It will be the first integrated test of the crew-capable vehicles, okay, with the crew aboard. And we're going to get a lot of data on human performance as we go out to the moon and orbit it and come back. The Orion will have its life support systems on board, and basically the big thing we're adding that's new from the Artemis 1 mission is a crew of 4 people. So I'd like to introduce you to the crew of Artemis 2. Our commander is Reed Weissman. His pilot will be Victor Glover in the back. Mission specialist Christina Koch, who spent a lot of time on space station, and Jeremy Hansen from the Canadian Space Agency, making his first flight ever in space to the moon. Okay, pretty good for your first flight. We'll round out the first crew. Now, these folks won't land on the moon. They will go beyond the moon and orbit it and then come back, but it's still a pretty sweet mission. Here's a little cartoon that shows that mission. So we launch from Earth, we orbit Earth a couple times, make sure everything is ready, then we fire our engines to go out to the moon, and we go way beyond the moon, further than anyone has gone from Earth before in all of human history. So these 4 people, at least for a while, will have the distinction of having gone further from Earth than anybody has ever gone. And then they swing back around and splash down in the ocean, and they're recovered. So that's the Artemis 2 mission. Then the big one. Artemis 3 is the landing. So in addition to all the equipment you saw for Artemis 2, we're adding now the lunar lander, the HLS, Human Landing System. So we will take 4 crew, put them in orbit around the moon. 2 of them will transfer to the lander and go down to the lunar surface. They will perform science for 6.5 days. And at the end of that time, they will get back in their spacecraft, come back to lunar orbit, and rendezvous with Orion again, and that will bring them home. It'll be the first time we've been to the moon. If this happens at the end of 2025, it'll be the first time we've sent people to the moon in 53 years. So for the Artemis 3 mission, we've chosen the lander that we're going to use, and it is the SpaceX lander, the big tall one. There we go. And SpaceX right now is designing and testing this system. It is impressively big, and very much unlike most landers we've ever seen before. But it is, big tanks of rocket fuel, and then up top here you have where the crew stays. So that will be the picture you see when we land. The thing that will be different about it, and will be the fact that we're landing at the south pole of the moon. So all of the Apollo missions landed in a very narrow range near the equator of the moon on the near side, the side that always faces Earth. And they did that because Apollo was a very compact program, so they designed landers that could only go certain places on the moon. They could only last 3 days on the surface. The spacesuits that the astronauts wore were literally designed so the zippers went up 3 times. And after that, they couldn't guarantee that you could get a spacesuit on the 4th time. So they performed 3 days worth of EVAs on the surface. So this will be different. We'll have a different lander. We're going to have different spacesuits when we go back. When we get to the next Artemis mission, so I'm going into a little more detail now on that one panel I showed you earlier. Artemis 4 will deploy the first pieces of the Lunar Gateway, this small space station in lunar orbit. And just like we have a big space station orbiting Earth right now, we'll have its companion in lunar orbit. And it won't be nearly as big, and it's really there as a transportation node, a place where Orion could go and dock, and the crew can prepare there to go to the moon, and the lander will be here on another port, and when they're ready, they get into the lander and go down to the surface. And of course, there's all kinds of other science you could perform on Gateway, because unlike the space station that orbits the Earth, this is in deep space. You are outside of the radiation belts of the Earth. You're outside of the magnetosphere of the Earth, and it's a truly deep space environment rather than kind of semi-protected the way we are in Earth orbit. So this is what the first mission will look like when we're done, and there's two elements of the Gateway there. It's a propulsion power element and a small habitation module. So that takes us through Artemis 4. Artemis 5, we start delivering pieces of hardware to the surface that we can use across multiple missions. And that includes things like rovers. So at NASA, we never take the easy term, right? It's very easy to call this a rover. But in the NASA world, this is not a rover, it's a lunar terrain vehicle, because that makes a very nice acronym, LTV. And it's very cool looking. Again, this is open for competition for a contractor to build it. And that's kind of a current procurement that's going on right now. Artemis 4 will also be another SpaceX lander. And then Artemis 5 is the first flight of the Blue Origin lander. We just chose Blue Origin as our second lander contractor, and their lander looks quite a bit different than the SpaceX one. It's quite a bit shorter. The crew is down here at the bottom rather than on top, and then you have the 2 big tanks of fuel on top of it. But it does the same thing. Its job is to get 4 people to the surface and then get them back to lunar orbit. So the lunar landers are really elevators. And NASA is buying an elevator service from both SpaceX and Blue Origin to take crews down to the moon, keep them there for a certain number of days, then bring them back. So a little different than when we did the lunar module back in Apollo, where NASA has a great deal of input into the design. Now we're basically buying services from commercial companies. And then there's Artemis 6 and beyond. I'm not going to get into that because it starts getting a little more nebulous as you go into the later missions, but we'll be adding on to the gateway, adding more modules onto the gateway, adding more infrastructure down on the lunar surface as well. So there you see a pressurized rover, for example, that we hope to send to the moon in Artemis 7 or perhaps a little later. Okay. So that's all great. So those are nice pictures, that are CAD-generated images, and NASA's pretty good at generating that kind of stuff. But when is this stuff going to get real? Well, it is real. Artemis 2, the next mission is going to fly at the end of next year. There's the Orion module. It doesn't have its outside panels on it yet, but it's completely built. There are the solid rocket motors that are going to be added to the core stage that will make up the SLS rocket. There's the engines for the SLS. Here's the service module that was delivered from the European Space Agency that will go underneath that. So the 4 crew members that I showed you, this is the vehicle they're going to ride. And so you can see it's at an advanced stage of assembly. Artemis 3, the mission that's going to take us back to the surface of the moon. There again is the structure of the Orion. We have the motors already. We have the solid rocket booster segments. And we have the service module for this that's being built in Bremen. So those parts are being built. SpaceX is testing the vehicle that will be the lander that lands on the moon in the southern part of Texas. And we have another contractor working on brand new spacesuits for us to wear on the lunar surface. I have a slide coming up of that. The new spacesuits look really, really cool. For some reason, spacesuits have always been white, except the Russians, which are kind of a little off-white. But we put astronauts in these beautiful white spacesuits, and then we put them out on the surface of the moon, which is the dirtiest place we can think of, with lunar soil that wants to stick to everything and turn it gray. So why do we keep doing white spacesuits? All right, so I talked a little bit about the SpaceX Starship. That's the name they've given to their lunar lander. And like I said, it's big. It's 50 meters tall, 9 meters in diameter. And they will fly an uncrewed mission of that lander, perhaps as early as 2024, next year, followed by the Artemis 3 and the Artemis 4 mission. And then the Blue Origin folks will pick up with the Artemis 5 mission, and then after that, it becomes kind of a trade-off of which lander is right for the next mission. So there's the Blue Origin lander. So very interesting. We have 2 lunar lander contractors, sort of owned by the 2 rich guys who are the new guys in the space business, and that's kind of exciting actually. Back in the Apollo days, we didn't have new space. It was, the usual space companies working on all this. But now we have a whole bunch of new space companies that are producing all kinds of amazing stuff. Okay, I'm going to talk for a second about the gateway. We talked about this coming up in pieces, that the first two pieces are these two in line with the power module. The lander docks here, the logistics module docks there, the Orion spacecraft bringing the crew docks there, and you can see how it starts looking like a small space station after a while. How many people have heard of near rectilinear halo orbit? One. Very good. At least there's one of you. So you're going to hear that term. And again, it's another NASA term. We like complicated terms for sort of simple things, although this isn't simple. Near rectilinear halo orbit is this sort of elliptical, potato chip actually shaped orbit around the moon. And as the moon goes around the Earth, that orbit always stays so that you could constantly see the entire orbit from Earth. That means we have continuous communication with the crew all the time. So we've developed this orbit, and it takes advantage of some quirks of the lunar orbit and gravity so that we can always see the spacecraft. So that's very interesting. There's other kinds of orbits we could use, but we decided on near rectilinear halo orbit because it's the hardest to say. All right, this is our new spacesuit. Just like the fact that we chose SpaceX and Blue Origin to build our lunar landers, we chose a commercial vendor to build our new spacesuit. So this is the Axiom EMU, and it's built by a relatively new company in Houston called Axiom Space. And notice what color it is. It is the color of lunar dirt. What a great idea. So you never know if that will actually get dirty or not, because it's just going to look the same all the time. But it's pretty cool looking. It almost looks like a Formula One, driver's suit. So I think it looks kind of nice. And then some of the other parts we're going to be developing will be the new lunar rover, the lunar terrain vehicle. So sort of an all-purpose vehicle for driving around the moon. Just an open cockpit. And so you see an artist concept of it here, and we're working on that right now. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff, and I keep pressing the wrong button, that you'll need in order to make a complete surface base. You're going to eventually need a habitat. And so we have people looking at designs for surface habitats, and there's one artist concept of that. You're going to need power on the surface. One of the things that will be very different when we go back to the moon is we're going back to the South Pole initially. So all those pictures you saw from Apollo of astronauts on the moon, everything was brightly lit, and it just looked like it was very easy to see. When you go to the poles, because the poles of the moon only get glancing light from the sun, there's going to be long shadows and lots of black and lots of dark. So it's not really going to look like this. You're just going to see lots of shadowed areas, and the spacesuits are going to have lights on them, and the rovers are going to have lights to drive around, because you'll be driving from very bright sunlit areas into very, very dark areas right next to them. And because of that, you're going to need a good power system. And so because the sun, just goes around the horizon and it dips, behind mountains and things, we need a power system that can furnish power continuously for us. So we are looking at a small nuclear fission power system. And there's some really cool designs out there. This one here all folds up into a little garbage can size. And it produces 10 kilowatts of power continuously. And so there's great ideas like this out there as a way to constantly generate power. And one of the reasons we'll need power is because we want to do that resource extraction from the moon. We want to go into those permanently shadowed craters and see what's in there. and dig up some of that material and put it in a processing plant and see if we could extract water from it. So the term we use, again, excuse the fact that we use complicated acronyms, is in situ resource utilization, ISRU. So if you hear ISRU, just think of living off the land. You know, how do you take resources that you find where you are and make them into something useful? So the kind of useful things we'll be doing is extracting oxygen from the lunar soil and from the water we find, mining for water, and maybe using that lunar soil for construction materials. It turns out lunar soil is made basically of the same components that glass is made out of. It's a lot of aluminum and silicon oxides, some iron in there as well. But if you heat that stuff up, you can make glassy materials, bricks. You could pave roads. You could do a lot of interesting things with them. Okay, so that is basically the Artemis program. To do a program like this requires a lot of cooperation. And one of the things NASA's been doing over the past few years is partnering with different countries, inviting them to be part of this great adventure. And so you can see this is the South Korean Minister of Science signing the Artemis Accords. And the Artemis Accords are basically a set of guidelines for how nations can work together to do exploration. It's based on the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Treaty from the 1960s, and somewhat on the Antarctic Treaty. So if you know, you can't, nobody could own a part of the Antarctic. You could have a base there for scientific reasons, but nobody owns it. That's sort of what the new treaties are, and that's what the Artemis Accords talk about. So here are the people who have signed the Artemis Accords, and including some of our favorite countries over here. All right. So, and I'm not going to read through this. It's somewhat legalese, but it basically says we're going to use outer space for peaceful purposes. You know, keep anything that's not peaceful out of space. We're going to work together cooperatively. If someone needs help in space, we're going to give it to them. You know, and nobody can, you know, plant a flag on the moon and say the moon is mine. You know, the moon and the planets belong to everybody. All right. And so I'm going to close by talking about Mars, because we've talked a lot about the moon so far, but you have to keep the big picture in mind. So when NASA puts together a plan like Artemis, and we talk about the Artemis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, et cetera, missions, there's a reason for why we picked the piece parts that we picked and why we structured it the way we did. And ultimately, it's so that we can get to Mars. So a lot of the stuff we're doing on the moon is meant to be a stepping stone to Mars, to test the technologies, to test some of the equipment that's necessary to take that next big step. So Mars is always in our mind as we design these things. So here's an example. So we're going to do the gateway around the moon. The gateway has a direct translation to a Mars transit vehicle that will need to take us to Mars. The habitats we use on the moon directly translate to the habitats we'll need for Mars. The rovers and transportation system will need those same things on Mars. Power systems on the moon, power systems on Mars, almost exactly the same. So there are some subtle differences because it's a different environment. The moon is a complete vacuum. Mars has a very thin carbon dioxide atmosphere, so everything won't be exactly the same. Gravity is different, but there's a lot of things that will be the same, and we're going to learn how to survive in space for long periods of time so that when we do finally press the button on our spacecraft and fire ourselves out to Mars, we would have reduced a lot of risks and we'll know what to expect. Okay, so finally, the NASA saying is we're going. And I think NASA adopted that because we've talked a lot over the years about going back to the moon, going to Mars, and really nothing's come of it. But now all the pieces seem to be in place that we're really going to do this. We really have a new launch vehicle. We really have an Orion capsule. We really have people building lunar landers and new spacesuits and the lunar rovers. And so for the first time, probably since Apollo, it looks like this is really going to happen. And so, as we say at NASA, we are going. So thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for everybody online for watching. And there's going to be lots of work to do. It's going to take lots of people from lots of countries to make this happen. And I hope to see you all in space or on some planet someday. Thank you.
Thank you for very nice talk about the Artemis program. I would like to start the questions asking you two questions. First, the Artemis 2 mission is going to have only the lunar lander or anything else in orbit?
So the Artemis 2 mission is a very simple mission because at that point we will not have the gateway yet. So really the only vehicles that are involved in this mission are the big rocket to boost the Orion out to the moon, the Orion capsule itself, and the lunar lander. Now, SpaceX has to deliver the lunar lander to the moon, so they have a big rocket as well. But that's really it. It's going to be very Apollo-like, where you just take a lander down, there's two people, and they work on the moon for a week, and they come back. So Artemis 2 is really us relearning the art of exploration on the moon. So it is a simpler mission, and they get progressively more complex after that.
But what I meant was to say, the lunar lander is very tall.
Yes.
50 feet.
50 meters.
50 meters.
50 meters.
Okay. Wow.
Yes.
50 meters tall. And the Orion looks like something smaller, right?
Yes, it is quite a bit smaller.
Yeah. So the two will be connected going from Earth to the moon.
Good question. I know they won't actually. And I don't know. There we go. So the lunar lander will be delivered to the moon by SpaceX. And it will, let's see, this is Artemis 2. I'm sorry, I was describing Artemis 3. You asked about Artemis 2?
I'm asking the mission that will have the tall lunar lander.
Okay, that's Artemis 3.
Okay.
So Artemis 3, SpaceX will deliver this lander through their own means to lunar orbit. And then NASA will launch the crew on the SLS and Orion, and they will meet up with the lander in lunar orbit.
Okay.
So that's where everything comes together. So the integration node is lunar orbit. And so it's the responsibility of the lunar lander contractor to have the lander waiting, and then NASA sends the crew once we know that lander is in place and orbiting the moon.
Okay. And my second question is about the Mars mission. Is it going to start from the moon or from the Earth?
That's a really good question. I've been working at NASA for 36 years, and that's actually a very good source of discussion for us. It all depends where we find propellant. If we find propellant on the moon, like water, that we could put in tanks and get up to lunar orbit, it makes sense to start a Mars mission from lunar orbit. If we don't find any resources that help us make rocket propellant, it makes more sense to start from Earth. So it's really, where is the gas station? Where's the petrol station? So if it's on Earth, you start from Earth. If you have a petrol station on the moon, you start from the moon.
Thank you.
Okay.
I would like to ask you, the audience, if you have any questions.
Okay, there's one here. And yell it out and I'll repeat it for everybody. Oh, or better yet, there's a microphone. And I've been walking around here pretty much this whole time, and I know the people driving the cameras, I'm probably driving them crazy.
Before you ask the question, let me make sure you understand. He mentioned this. Brazil is participating in the Artemis program, okay? So just repeating this.
Okay, yes.
I understand the reason that we have to take something to the moon because we have to do research for it and it's preparation for Mars. But why do we have to crew the rockets with humans? Why can't we send machines to do the science for us on the moon, on Mars, and stuff like that?
Well, sure, we could. There is a way of thinking that says, why send people into space at all, right? We can do a lot of science with rovers and robots. I have a very good friend who was the chief scientist of the Spirit and Opportunity rovers, the ones that had been on Mars for many years and have done all kinds of crazy good science. And he was also involved in the Mars Pathfinder. And so we asked him, you know, this rover has been on Mars for a year, and it's done great science. If instead of that rover you sent a human, how long would it have taken a human to do that same amount of science? And he says about 6 hours. And so, so rovers and robots are good, and they're best used in places where we don't want to send humans, places that are too risky, like inside permanently shadowed craters. But in terms of doing pure science, there is nothing that can match human hands and a human brain actually at the science site until robots get very, very advanced, and they're not quite there yet. So right now, human explorers still are orders of magnitude more efficient than robotics. I have another interesting story about that too, because there are actually folks who believe we shouldn't send people into space at all, and that's fine to believe that. So I live in Houston, Texas, and it's about a 20-hour drive to get to Disney World. So imagine this: there's two ways to get to Disney World, and we'll call this one the human mission way, and the other one the robotic mission way. So the human mission way to get to Disney World is, you know, I drive all the way to Disney World, 20 hours, park in the parking lot. I spent 7 wonderful days there, you know, having fun, and especially the Star Wars stuff is awesome. And then I get back in my vehicle and drive home. It takes a long time to get there, but I'm very happy. I have all kinds of, you know, good stuff with me and good memories. I could have done that robotically. And I would do that by, instead of me going to Disney World, I send somebody with a camera to go to Disney World for me and photograph all the cool stuff, and I sit in my house and watch it. And we'll call that robotic Disney. And is that really the same thing? See, I'd rather do the Disney thing myself. So just maybe a couple different perspectives of how to look at that. But that is an excellent question. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, pretty much what is happening is it's easier to send robots to the moon so they can stay longer, so you don't have to worry about the resources about sending humans, but it's more efficient to send humans, right?
So for long distance missions, that would be a risky mission for a human to stay years on the moon or years on Mars. Robots are very good for that. For doing scientific investigations that require a lot of thinking and interaction with the surface and the science, that's where humans excel. And so I think an ideal mission actually makes use of both, right? You take humans and you take robots, and you let the robots do the stuff that they're the best at, and you let the humans do the stuff that they're best at. All right, anything else?
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. By the way, so since we have folks here, How many people here would go into space if somebody gave you a free ticket to ride into space? Okay, good. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'll need about 25 tickets. Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation, Connolly. According to my understanding, there will be different lunar landers, crewed and uncrewed lunar landers. Is it correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
There are a number of lunar landers being developed. I showed you the 2 big ones that the U.S. is having their commercial partners develop. The Europeans are developing a mid-sized lunar lander for delivering large logistics and cargo. And there are many, many small lunar landers being developed by many different commercial companies to deliver science equipment.
So in this case, the lunar lander will be launched from the Earth with astronauts and goes straight to the moon and land there with the astronauts. So we don't need a capsule, an Orion anymore.
Well, theoretically you could do that, but the current concept is that the lander is launched without a crew and it goes to lunar orbit and waits. And once it achieves lunar orbit and we check it out, then the crew is launched separately on the crew launch vehicle and they meet up in lunar orbit. So yeah, right now the lander doesn't have crew on it when it's launched. And there's a number of reasons for that because it actually takes there's a lot of operations between its launch and it getting to the moon. And you don't want to put people in deep space for that long.
Oh, I got it. So the last question is just this point. Why not send the lunar lander straight, uncrewed from the Earth to the moon, and it lands on the moon, and the Orion with a small system lander lands just beside the main lander. So we could send both separately. Is it possible? Is it? Would it be better than dock them in the lunar orbit?
So what you just described is what I would call a dual lunar lander mission. And in that case, the big lunar lander becomes the surface habitat. And what you're proposing is you land the crew in a separate very small lander, maybe like the Apollo lander. That is a viable concept. The reason that landers are as big as they are is because it takes a lot of propulsive energy to get into the gravity well of the moon and then have enough fuel left to get back out. So, the SpaceX lander certainly, shows that physically, and even the Blue Origin lander has those big tanks on it. So, there is actually there's no such thing as a small lunar lander. The Apollo lander is probably the closest to the very smallest thing you can land on the moon. And really, keep in mind, it was designed to land only a very small part of the moon and last 3 days there. And so we want landers that will land more people, can go anywhere on the moon, and can last many weeks or months. So as you do that, your propulsive needs grow bigger and your tanks grow bigger and the lander grows bigger. And unfortunately it's just physics at some point. So there's a lot of physics in space flight, and lunar landers are definitely part of that. I wrote a book all about lunar landers if you look it up. All right, next please.
Hi, I have 2 questions actually. The first one is if there are any strategies under development to prevent damage to the technological systems or the astronauts' health from geomagnetic storms, if they are needed. And the second question, I was curious about the Gateway orbit. Is the intention that the Gateway keeps it close to the moon, or does it eventually may reach the inner magnetosphere?
Okay, sounds like you're very interested in the magnetosphere. We're very interested in how magnetic storms, and in particular solar proton events, affect astronauts. It would be very bad to be out in space during a solar flare, a solar storm. And luckily, it's quite easy to protect from it. So you just have to put some mass, especially mass that contains a lot of hydrogen, between you and the solar proton event. So we are actually designing the vehicles so they have built-in radiation protection as much as possible. And if it's a really bad solar storm, you just start kind of burrowing yourself into the food and the fuel, and you wait it out for the couple hours while it peaks. But that's actually one kind of radiation you could shield from using common materials. The one that's more difficult is the galactic cosmic ray background. Those are much higher energy particles, and you can't really shield from those. So we're actually more worried about those. And then your other question was about where the gateway orbits relative to the geotail of the moon, of the Earth. Okay, so you're right. We are going to. The moon rotates around the Earth once every 28 and a half days. And so once every 28 and a half days, it passes through the geotail. And I'm not aware of anything we do special during that time or not. But that's a really good question. Thanks. All right. Next. We're waiting for the microphone here. Got a couple.
Yeah.
We'll get to you eventually.
I wanted to know about that spacecraft you showed on the other screen when you compared the moon with Mars.
Okay. That one?
That one in the Martian sky.
Okay. So the one on top?
Yeah.
Kind of cool looking, isn't it? So that is a nuclear, let's see, is that nuclear thermal or nuclear electric? That is a nuclear electric spacecraft. And so what it has is it has a nuclear reactor out at this end, and it has electric propulsion on each of these booms here. And electric propulsion is it's very efficient, but it's very low thrust. So a spacecraft like that will slowly accelerate its way out of Earth orbit and then get into interplanetary space and then slowly wind its way down into Martian orbit. But even it's slow, but it will use very little fuel doing that. So that's one of the tricks we have up our, to our advantage as spacecraft designers. We can use things like electric propulsion if there's enough power to give it a reasonable amount of thrust. So that is a solar electric propulsion spacecraft. So that's a reactor there. There's a bunch of radiators to get rid of the excess heat, and the crew is back here hidden behind some shielding with the thrusters. So that's a good one. We're also looking at nuclear thermal rockets, which are a little different, where you use a small nuclear reactor just to produce heat, and you push a fluid through them like hydrogen, and it expands greatly because of all the heat it's taking in, and goes out the back engine and accelerates you forward. So both of those are sort of viable concepts for propulsion systems that don't involve chemicals. And I'll get on a little soapbox here. Is there anybody here interested in winning a Nobel Prize? Okay, a couple. How about changing the course of humanity? Okay, same people. Right now, we as a species are stuck in the inner solar system. We can't get past Mars because of chemical propulsion. Chemical propulsion is what you typically see in spacecraft, where we combine things like oxygen and hydrogen or methane and oxygen together, and we burn them in great quantities and push them out the back of the spacecraft. We're limited by the laws of the rocket equation. And if anybody really wants to, get people really traveling out to the outer planets or to the stars, we have to figure out a new kind of propulsion system that doesn't rely on chemical propulsion. We need the next big step forward in physics of propulsion. So if you got an idea in mind and you want to win a Nobel Prize and change the course of humanity, just develop a new propulsion system that breaks the rocket equation. Good. That's your challenge.
Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, a couple more.
Hello, I would like to ask you about the virtual barrier between us and Mars. Nowadays, we are putting a lot of effort to know Mars and build vehicles like Starship to go to Mars. And a few years ago, we started to produce oxygen on Mars with the MOXIE experiment. But how long we are to land on Mars, and what will be the next steps after the Artemis mission? Sorry about my English.
No, thank you. I understood that perfectly. Thank you. I apologize for my Portuguese. So you mentioned the MOXIE instrument. MOXIE is an instrument that takes the atmosphere of Mars, which is carbon dioxide, and it electrically breaks it into carbon monoxide and oxygen. It's relatively simple to do, but we had to prove that we could do it on Mars. And we have actually produced pure oxygen out of the Martian atmosphere, so we know we can do that. Experiments like MOXIE are the first step in getting all this stuff done. So where we show like in situ resource utilization, a little rover, that could be the MOXIE instrument right there. In fact, the MOXIE instrument is on a rover, right? So we start with small experiments on robotic missions, and once we prove that that technology works, it grows into bigger and bigger systems that eventually may produce all the oxygen that the crew needs when they land on Mars. So, like I said, we're going to start at the moon and try to mine oxygen and water on the moon. You could actually crack oxygen out of the lunar soil. The soil is basically all oxides. So if you heat it up enough, you liberate oxygen from it. So we're going to try to do all this on the moon in the next decade. And then I would say you'll start seeing a transition where instead of an Artemis 2 mission, which is a flyby of the moon to test all the systems, you'll have an Artemis 25 mission, which is a flyby of Mars to test all the systems. And then on Artemis 26, there might be the first landing on Mars. And I would say that's somewhere in the 2030s. So you guys are like the perfect age to do this, by the way. I would trade my age with you right now to be a little younger so I could be part of that. I think it would be very cool. Okay, any more? I think there was one more right here. And I'll stay around afterwards if you want to come and ask questions too.
Hello. Okay,
Hola.
I hate speaking in the microphone, but first I want to thank you for the presentation. And my question is related to the fission surface power. How are the astronauts are going to deal with the waste caused by the fission? Because when it happens in Earth, we have the waste, right? So what's gonna happen to it?
So this is basically a self-contained little unit, and it will produce power until you get to a certain half-life of all of its nuclear material. At that point, we'll drop the control rods into it and just let it go cold. So it really we don't have to take the old control rods out and store them somewhere and worry about all that. Really, the whole unit is about as round as one of these tables and maybe about this tall. And so, and all the stuff on top is just the radiators. And so when it gets to the end of its nuclear fuel life, you drop the control rods in and it just goes cold. And well, I guess you leave it there, or I don't know, make a table out of it perhaps. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Oh, is there one more question? Okay. Thanks all for coming. I'll stay around here if you have any other questions, but I really appreciate you guys coming out. This Wednesday night's lecture series has been great. We get to know you guys, you get to know us a little bit, and we'll end with this one question.
Let's say we found a large amount of resources in the moon. Are there any plans to bring those resources to the Earth in a large scale, like bring a large amount of those resources?
It would have to be something really, really special. So just the cost of transportation to get things from the moon to the Earth makes even transporting pure gold impractical. It would cost more to get it here than it would have value. So we would have to find something on the moon that is so valuable that it's worth bringing to Earth. And guess what? There is something. There is an isotope of helium called helium-3. And helium-3 is the perfect fuel for fusion reactors. A helium-3 fusion reactor produces no radioactive byproducts. And we know that helium-3 is implanted in the lunar soil by the sun all the time, and we have to figure out a way how to get it all out, molecule by molecule. But if you could find helium-3 and mine it, a tanker car full of helium-3 would be enough to power South America for a year. So that's probably one thing that's valuable enough to bring back.
Yeah, and it's not too heavy.
Yeah, and it's not too heavy, that's right. You can make balloons out of it, I suppose. Okay, well, thank you again for coming out tonight.
I would like to invite the director of INPE, Dr. Clésio, to thank you for your talk.
Thank you very much, John. It was a pleasure to receive you here. I wish you have more people present here than in YouTube. We have several audience in YouTube is pretty high. If you check it out in YouTube, INPE's channel, you're gonna see a lot of people are saying, but this new generation, those are the guys that come into Mars, so they are in the right place right now. Never mind, I would like to give you this kind of just souvenir for our space agency. We also have some mug from our satellite Amazon 1 there. So you can drink some of your pure water drained from the pole of the lunar mission in that mug, and then we remember the time you have been here. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. I will end on this note that if we do find water on the moon, there's a historical event that will probably happen. Imagine astronauts on the moon and they've used their machinery to squeeze the water out of whatever they find in the permanently shadowed craters, and they come up with this much water. And that's amazing, because that's water that doesn't come from Earth. And then the astronaut opens the lid and drinks it. For the first time in human history, we would have consumed water that didn't come from our planet. Very interesting historical event.
And if they are in kind of ice, you cannot even drink them, just put in the whiskey.
Oh, that's true. If you have ice, yeah. You can make mixed drinks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.